kind of sign in by sharing who you are in the chat feature, who you are, what you teach, so that anybody who's watching kind of has an idea of who the audience is and who's participating, because you are as important as everybody else in here. There we go. Awesome. So we have the high school folks. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. A little thrown off, but good. We have this rolling. So our practice focus this month is engaging in argument from evidence. This is our last PLC for this calendar year, but for our school calendar year, we'll be back in January. So we do have one January through May. 5 more to look forward to, but we do not have one in December for the holidays. A little bit of reprieve for everyone. And looking at this particular practice, we're looking at it through the lens of science and in engineering. I've got a lot of feedback happening. I don't know if you guys can hear that or not. All right, and so scientists defend explanations based on evidence with a solid foundation of data, whereas engineers are making arguments from evidence to defend their conclusion, evaluate the ideas of others, and then revise their design. This noise is driving me crazy. I have like 4 voices right now. All right, and so we have our progressions, and we looked at this last month with our developing and using models PLC, and so I think it's just really good practice to look at the grade bands and decide what are those key verbs in each one of the grade bands. So what are the key verbs for this practice in order to know what students are doing? What are they doing, the verbs, in order to be able to perform in argumentation from evidence? And so could I just get like a verbal hello from a couple of people to make sure that you guys, because I can't, once I show this, I can't see anybody else or any of the comments.
Hi, Rachel here.
Hi, Linda here.
Nice.
Hi, this is Bill Stockton.
There we go. Okay, so there are 4 of us that verbally responded. So we're going to break this up into the 4 different grade bands. And let's see, Rachel, I know that you're a high school, but if you would look at K2 and I'll give you a couple minutes to just look through those verbs, pick out the verbs that really kind of describe what argumentation and evidence is and what you think those K2 students are doing to show that they're arguing with evidence. And then I will do 3 through 5. Linda, if you would do 6 through 8, and Bill 9 through 12. We'll just kind of jigsaw this, and then we'll come back together and share our conclusions. And I'll give 2 minutes, starting now. Another minute. Okay, and Rachel, I picked on you to go first. You were here for our last PLC, so I know that you were familiar with the drill here. And so on K2, what verbs did you identify, and what are you seeing students in grades K through 2 doing to demonstrate their argument from evidence?
Well, I think it's pretty impressive what we're asking them to do. We're asking them to use evidence to distinguish between arguments that are actually supported and arguments that aren't, to distinguish between opinions and evidence, to analyze and determine if evidence is relevant, listen actively, construct an argument, and make claims about the effectiveness of a solution or tool.
Okay, awesome. And for 3 through 5, I think for me, it's the third bullet down where it's that word respectfully provide. And so it's not necessarily the verb provide and receive. Critiques is what they're doing, but that they qualified how that had to be done. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the PLC. But they are that's when they're starting to interact with peers and critique their own arguments between each other and the evidence that is provided for each one. And I think in the grades 3 through 5, that's the first time that that kind of emerges in that progression. And then Linda, 6 through 8.
Okay, so this one definitely builds on those. You can see that progression, but I think the main focus is evidence. So the first one, compare and critique, they're looking at 2 different arguments, 2 different sides of something, but they're really analyzing the evidence to determine which one's better. And then as you go down, they're still analyzing evidence and providing evidence in their arguments. And so like the third bullet, to construct, use, or present oral and written arguments, they're still using evidence to back their claims. So I think that's the main focus for that one, for 6 through 8.
Awesome. And Bill, 9-12.
Yeah, so just kind of building on what Linda just said, evidence is still at kind of the forefront, but now with the evidence, we want to start looking at limitations that the evidence has, and also looking at some of the ethical issues that arise with the data and evidence that we're looking at. And then as we get farther down, and how she pointed out the one where we're going to start making oral and written claims, the big difference with 9 through 12 is they have to start defending their claims based on the evidence that they're using, and then also be willing to evaluate competing designs and solutions.
Awesome. So the way that this progressions really helped me, and we talked about this last month too, but it's excellent to think about every single time, is that this is a building upon of skills and of student performance expectations. But it's also important to remember that we're a new state in coming to this, and so somebody in 6 through 8 could still be building on those skills from 3 through 5 because it's not something that they've had in their entire school career, and that teachers in 9 through 12 are going to experience that lack of experience the most acutely for these first few years. It's also something to think about how to differentiate instruction for students who are struggling with argumentation from evidence to pull up that progression and look at the grade levels beforehand and what that's expected, so that we're able to let the student participate and engage in the practice, but on a level that makes sense for him or her. Any questions or comments about that? Okay. Go.
So we modeled all the freshwater in the hotel world, and this is all the freshwater, but and water and saltwater and everything. But this is all the saltwater in the world, and this remaining percent is all the fresh water, not fresh water, but glaciers, frozen, and fresh water. And then this percent, and then this percent is all of our fresh water, lakes, rivers, and everything. So, but then the total percentage of all the water that we can get to is the accessible freshwater is this.
So I'm confused
Would be 1,000. One of these would be 1,000.
because you guys are talking about in percents, right? And all of these guys out here know what percent means. Per percent is each 100. They have way more than 100 out there, don't they? So
This is,
and we need some explanation, right?
oh, we had so this is so how we knew how to make all of these thousands is because it's a 0.1. It has 0.1, and then how many of these goes into that? 10. How many of these go into that? 10. And then we realized we thought this is 100, and then this goes into 1,000, and then this is 4 zeros, which would and 3 zeros. It'd be 10,000 because the 4 zeros are backing it up because 3 zeros are the comma right here, and it'd be 10,000. And so we saw that. So this isn't 1,000. This is 10,000. That's why we have so many of these. So it takes 10,000 0.01 or 0.01%. This is the 0.01%. But the real question is 1,000. So it takes 1,000 of these to make 100%. Which this is all the total accessible. Actually, for all of this, it's a 10 because you have to.
But wouldn't it be instead of one?
Garrett was right because we modeled this as this. So and then this is 100. This is 10,000 times. This is 10,000 times. So that's. I can understand how you're not confused. So this is all the fresh water that we can access and that we can use that's not polluted. And then this is, so this and this is all the seawater. This is just this 2%, 2 whole percent is glaciers and ice caps. This is all the fresh water, but and then there's polluted water, which is this takes away polluted accessible water. Yeah. And then this is accessible. How much accessible? As it says, quote unquote. So total water on the earth that is actually accessible for humans to consume. So that's what this says. Question: what about? But if it was actually 10,000, which it is up there, how come you don't have? The 10 would actually be it would be the 1% because then the 1 would be the only part of the 1,000 because the 1 would go to 1,000 times, but the 10 would actually, it should be, the 1 should be a 10. Yeah, the 1 should be a 10 because it's 1,000. It's not 1,000. Yeah, but you got to times it times 10 since it's not 1,000. Yeah.
Actually, I kind of disagree with Sawyer because it was 0.01%, and that takes 10,000 of those to make 100%. So they have 10,000 up there. So that little tiny cube, 10,000 of those equals that. So they actually are.
Yeah, actually, 100 of those would have to equal that, wouldn't it? No, this is, there are 1,000 of those would actually equal that. So, I don't get how it would be that way instead of a tiny little cube. Okay, a little cube would be 1,000. Okay.
So do they have something to say about it? Is that what you guys want to talk about? Go ahead, Kyle.
Okay. 10 of 10,000 is 1%. No, not 1%. It's 0.0. It is. 10 out of 10,000 is 1%, and 1,000 out of 10,000 is 10%. So if you go one below 100, then you get 1%, and then if you go one below that, you get 1, 2, which is 10 less than 1%. So smack that up. Thank you very much, Alan. So Stella.
So when you're modeling the 10,000, why don't you show like the actual, so like what Sawyer said, like the one should represent, and that's the 10. For the 1,000, when you have all of your 10,000s together, how does that represent? You need to represent like with the 3 and the 2, and that's a scale model of the actual 10,000.
I thought it was going to be 10 because I thought that 1,000 would be 0.
But you want to see something really cool?
That it's 10. If you put this is 100. Yeah, so you put 100 of those 10 blocks, but I don't get how that's 100. But there's 1,000 of these. Yes, but that's only that one instead of that 10,000. And so it'd have to be 10 for the 10,000 instead of 10 for the 1. So it actually be 10 instead of 1.
This is not the 0.01%.
This would be 1%. I don't get how that would be 0. No,
Let's talk about it.
So this is 0.10%. This is 0.01%. It takes 10 of these to make one of these, which is, and then it takes 10 of these. So one of these is 1%, and we have 1, and then this is 10,000.
I'm going to stop it there and go back, because I just want you to think about, that's an example of 5th grade. And so that's a 5th grade classroom engaging in argument from evidence. And what sort of verbs did you see them engaging in that showed that they were engaging in this practice?
I would definitely say that they were trying to construct and support the argument using their model. They kept referring back to the shape and the size of the model they were using. I definitely think that was happening throughout the whole time. They also were providing and receiving critiques from their peers as they were trying to propose their explanation.
And I think that I would say that it was respectful because you could tell they were all trying to understand and make sense of it. And they weren't being disrespectful to each other. They were just trying to evaluate what everybody was saying and make sense of it.
Absolutely, and that's a conversation that I hear from teachers a lot, is that, yeah, students love to argue, but it always escalates, or it's not necessarily constructive or productive. And so just like we train students in procedures of how to turn things in and complete homework and label their papers or whatever we're needing to do, having them engage in these practices and teaching them almost like this progression and having it build up dependent on where they are is really important. And the differentiating an emotional argument from an academic argument is something that is really paramount for students to be able to be successful here. And so that class did not start that way. That was about 2 or 3 months of work for them to get to that point, because their experience was, one, limited, and two, the argumentative experience that they had was from emotional arguments.
I think it's neat that you gave them time to figure it out and make sense of it, and that you didn't jump in and interrupt them. And I know that probably not all of the students in there were understanding it, but a lot of them, probably half, were really digging into it and trying to make sense of it. And a lot of times they don't have time to do that, to have that complete thought.
And the students who were not speaking were engaged in different ways and thinking about it and had a deeper understanding when they, at the end, more than when they started. And they were a couple of minutes into recess at that point and were still going, which was, I think is kind of awesome. But, if they have a goal to work toward, that they end up kind of digging into it further. And a lot of the students who were arguing and getting into it were, there were some with IEPs or different diagnoses that you wouldn't necessarily guess. So that was an example of those verbs in 5th grade. And so we do have some examples of higher level engagement in argumentation, kind of as that end goal of our K through 12 system. What are we trying to get them to do, and what does that look like? And so Linda Rost is here with us and has been participating in the PLC. She's going to be our first teacher to share. We're going to have about 15 minutes for that share back and forth and questions of what she is doing in her classroom in a unit that she's developed. And then we'll also have Bill Stockton go right after her. And so we want this to be a conversation. So make sure that if you have a question or you have anything to add or comments or just clarification, that you do that. And Linda, you wanted me to pull yours up, correct?
Yep.
Okay. And
or
so
I can share the screen or whatever, because I have a video stuff.
Okay. I don't know if Jess is still here.
Yes, I am. I'm actually about to leave for a doctor's appointment, but Michelle's going to take over my computer. But I can make Linda a presenter.
Okay, I just recorded. Okay, am I on? I think I pulled the webcam up too.
Yep, you're good to go.
But how do I make it go to my screen? Is it on my screen?
Oh, you just closed it. It was.
Okay, all right. Okay, so this is the unit that I developed, and I got the information and the idea from the Learning Hub from, I think it's beartrust.org, and I'll tell you a little bit about how this is different from that in a minute. But the big idea was the controversy surrounding the grizzly bears, and that they've recently this summer been taken off the endangered species list. And that decision was based on 3 different, what they call demographic recovery criterion. And so what I did was I had the students look at the raw data and evaluate the data based on the recovery criterion, and then determine if they thought the grizzly bear should have been taken off. But it was kind of a confusing way that I did the grouping, so I'll try to explain that, and then I'll explain how it's different from the one on the Bear Trust website. So I'll go down to I'll kind of flash the criterion here. So the first one was based on adult females and a number of adult females, and this is directly from, let's see, where did I cite it? The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. So that's where the data and the criterion came from. So those are the 3 criterion. The first one's on adult females. The second one is on the 16 bear management units, or the 18 bear management units, or BMUs, that they were monitoring. And then the third one was on independent females and males and the babies, and looking at their mortality rates. So each group was, so each criterion had their own group. So group 1 only looked at criterion 1 and the data for that. Group 2 looked at criterion 2, and group 3 looked at criterion 3. And so this was day 1. Each group had 6, because I have 18 in that class. So they just all got in a big group. They all had their Chromebooks, and I'll put the data up. So this is similar to the data from the Bear Trust website, but I changed a little. The differences were on the Bear Trust lesson. It was really prescriptive in terms of how the students were to analyze the data. It gave really specific instructions, and some of it was kind of like I went through the activity as a student, and some of it was really confusing, and I didn't understand what the data meant and what it was representing. I just kind of went through the steps, and I wasn't really internalizing what I was even doing. I was just doing the steps. So I took all of that off, and I just gave them the raw data, and I streamlined it a little bit. And but I didn't tell them what to graph or how to graph it. All I said was, these are your criterion, here's your raw data. Figure out if you think the criterion have been met. So each student or each group had like 2 or 3 pages of data. One group had more of a map and some data, so that was group 2. Let me go back to the other file. And then group 3 had more data, so they had different things. They had to produce 2 or 3 graphs, or a graph and a map, or 3 graphs. But they had to decide. I didn't tell them what to do. So that was the first day. They all worked together. Some groups, like one person would work on one graph, another person would work on another graph, and then they would share. And some of that was good and bad, because some of them didn't really know enough information about, they knew their graph, but they didn't know the other one, so there were pros and cons to that. The second day, we mixed up the groups. So they got together in new groups. Now we had 6 groups of 3 students, and each new group had 1 representative for each of the 3 criterion. So they sat down and they presented their data, and I'm going to show you a video of what that looked like in a minute. And then they had to write this, they had to fill out these evidence-based analysis sheets, which I'll show you, and then they had to write this essay all together. They were working on one Google Docs document. So the first 3 paragraphs were describing each of the 3 recovery criteria and discussing specifically if they had been met, and providing evidence from their graphs and their data. And then the 4th paragraph was if they think together collectively if they thought that they should have been delisted. Some of them said things like, well, the males can be delisted, but the females can't. So they kind of had some interesting combinations, which I thought was neat. And then paragraph 5, they had to look at the pros and cons of delisting them. What are some factors we need to look at going forward? So so this was just some background information that I put together, and showing the map and some history of the grizzly bears being listed back in the 70s. And then if we scroll down, this was a map that group 2 had to work with. And here's the different bear management units. There are 18 of them. And then this is the evidence sheet. I did this because I really wanted to make sure that they were digging into their graph and really analyzing it. I don't like to do worksheets like this, but I wanted to make sure they were really analyzing their data. So they had to answer these questions for each graph that they made. They were looking at patterns and trends. How did they analyze the data? Why did they choose to present their data that way? And then, has the demographic recovery criterion been met, and provide evidence. So this really allowed them, I don't know where the rest of that sentence went. This allowed them to kind of practice their presentations before they got into their new groups the next day. So let me see if I covered everything here, and then I'll go to the video. One thing before I show the video one way that I kind of measure the success of a unit or a lab is when I see those kids that have IEPs or that are flunking every other class, when they're really engaged and digging into the activity and what we're doing, and they're really digging into the data. I think, because the advanced kids are going to do that anyway, but when it's the struggling kids that are really digging in and really engaged, I think that's a sign of a good lesson. I really saw that with this. It seems like kind of a dry lesson, like we just graphed and then they wrote a paper. So it seems like it's not anything that exciting, but they were really engaged and excited and coming in after school, and they just loved it. So we spent 3 days on this. We did 1 day for the first part where they were in the big groups with the 3 criterion, and then in the new groups they spent 2 days. So the first day they looked at the data and analyzed it and shared together, and then the next day they worked on writing their essay. So let me flip over to a video of kind of sharing their data. Can you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here's a quick video.
Okay, so this one tells
There's a lot of chatter because they're all working, so hopefully you can hear them well enough.
But what was surprising is like the big areas have the number of population.
What I showed is in this, the high population levels are in the red, the medium are orange, and the lower, which there was only one of them that was yellow, so it shows that there's some places where there is like lower, but most of the places, the larger areas, like the larger the areas, the more like their population group. So it's a higher population. Like, and it's kind of that way. Then graph number 2, the bar graph showed bears in the 18 different bear managements, which most of them were really high or higher than others. Then it's kind of self-explanatory, you know. And
wow, and then this is the other graph, and it shows like how like it's pretty much the same as the map, except it shows however many birds each county like Hilgard, not county, like area. Hilgard had 6, and see Gallatin, most of them had 6, and then some of them had like 5 or 4. And then in graph 2, the total morality for all those years, the estimated total morality was going down for a while, and then it dropped one day, and started going back up. And then the annual morality was
Yeah, one thing is actually
So would you say that they met the criteria of this one, Shelby? Yeah, that one.
what's off your information? Did you nails? Like over time. The only thing I think we probably which I think they should try to like more develop the female, like I don't know if they said like the game, or like just wait till the female population really like gets up a little bit, so you can provide that as evidence if you guide for it from your graphs. Then can I see your graphs thing for yeah, what's your so what like happened to your okay, so the early years 32 years, yeah, the first, so like for the first 15 years, wait, yeah, in 15 years there's no recording at all, and then the second half 17 years do they start decreasing the loss? Oh yeah, so is that the females or the this is the females on the I gave it. All right, and then there's 11 recordings in 17 years.
Okay. You click out of here. Okay, so those are some examples of their work, and I have some like examples of their student work and their graphs. And I don't think you want me to read it, but I was really impressed with especially those lower performing kids, how much they dug into the data, and they pulled out patterns and things that I didn't see when I was doing it. And I was just really impressed with the depth and the quality of their work. And it was a really engaging activity. And I provided very little guidance when they were making their graphs. They had done an activity about a couple weeks before that with the same format where I didn't tell them what to graph or how to graph, and they had to make those decisions. So they had done that before, so there was a little scaffolding there. But overall, I was really impressed with it, and it was a very engaging unit. So I think that's everything. Do you guys have any questions?
Linda, I think it's amazing. And I love how you talked about what they had done for the Bear Trust unit on the website, you know, through their organization, and then how you took the data and the idea and kind of flipped it and tweaked it a little bit to make it more three-dimensional so that students were engaging in that process rather than being led by the hand to do it. And so instead of it being more like a canned lesson or a canned activity where they're not making those decisions, you gave them the power to make all of those decisions, and they found things that maybe, I mean, that you didn't know it was there, but maybe wouldn't have been identified in the other one as well, in the Bear Trust one. And so they were really digging into it in a meaningful way, which meant that they were the ones engaging in the practices. And so I think it's awesome.
And the Bear Trust one didn't really have any closure. Like there was no piece where they had to summarize or decide or defend their claim. There was nothing at the end. It was just make the graphs and that was it. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think that these students, like coming in, maybe half of them really have no experience with defending claims with evidence. And so just that they had to specifically refer to the graphs and explain the graphs to back up their evidence, and just using that practice, and that should definitely be the central focus of units that we do in order to meet this practice. So it has to be specific, and this is a really good way to address that.
And you gave them a very romantic topic, you know,
right.
Grizzly bears are magnetic. It's something that attracts a lot of attention, and definitely the attention of a high schooler. And, you know, as the data changes and evolves, what kind of graphs are being evolved, and looking back at previous years' essays for other students, I mean, it will evolve and change as you go along, which is also a sign of a truly three-dimensional lesson, and that it's based in real data.
Right. Yeah, it was really good. And I think like very seldom are they asked to make a claim and defend it by evidence, and it's sort of asking for their opinion, but then they have to back it with evidence. And so I think that piece is really engaging too, where there isn't really a right answer either. That's important too. It's not clean cut, and there's not a right answer. And they can also have a fun combination of answers, like keeping the females protected but not the males, or protecting the young, or managing different parts of it. I think that part, there's no clear-cut answer, and I think that's really engaging too. So it was good.
Absolutely. Not something you can necessarily just Google.
Right.
Yeah, awesome work.
Thank you for sharing that, Linda. That was awesome.
Yeah. And so Linda took a very romantic topic and gave it a lot of hard data and a way for students to engage in it in a meaningful way. And Bill Stockton, he is our next teacher feature. He's on, and I have an intro screen for him as well, but I would just be the presenter for a moment for that to happen. He took a topic that many teachers are terrified of, climate change, and made it very, very approachable as far as argumentation and what that looks like in the classroom. That can go in a lot of different ways, and he made it extremely approachable for teachers. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill.
So let me see if I can get my webcam set up. Can everybody see my screen right now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, let's see here. Am I on there now?
You are.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I wanted to look at climate change, and I specifically wanted to kind of look at it through the lens of Indian Education for All, as well as argumentation and analyzing and interpreting data. And so I made a 5E lesson that kind of centered around an important report that the Salish and Kootenai tribe created. And so they created their own climate change report in 2013, and the document it's pretty extensive, and a lot of the students here, obviously, other than seeing pieces of it, are not very familiar with it. And so I wanted to take useful information out of that we could use in the classroom and make it a little more accessible to them without having them go through the whole report. And so I start kind of just with an engage activity that the idea was just to kind of get them looking at climate change data. And so it's going to show them, you know, just this graph, and with the graph, there's going to be variance in these predictions. And so it gives them an opportunity to kind of look at some of the data and why there's such a variety in the predictions that are coming out about possible climate change outcomes. And so it just kind of gets them looking at that that data and kind of experiencing a graph representation of it. Once we get done with that, it really gets us into the main point, which is looking at these 8 kind of pieces of data. And it was kind of fun selecting the data. Like I mentioned, I wanted to use that tribal resource. And so a lot of their data comes from tribal elders. And maybe I should, before I show you guys this, I've got a quote down here. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping around, but I think this quote that I have towards the bottom in one of the handouts from the document is real important. And it talks about cultural resources. So it says cultural resources are precious tribal resources, right? They encompass the tribes, elders, languages, cultures, traditions, and cultural sites. They include the fish, wildlife, and plants native to the region and the landforms and landmarks. Tribal elders and the language are perhaps the most vital of these resources because they teach and communicate the histories and traditional lifestyles of the tribes. And so I really wanted to focus on that tribal voice. And the document that CSKT provided, they really focus on histories that were reported by tribal elders, and they use that as some of their data when making recommendations on what should be done. And so as we look through some of the data that students are given in this activity, they're given quantitative data such as the global average air temperatures increased by 1.3 degrees, all since all in the last, most of it in the last century since the Industrial Revolution. The world's average temperature has gone 2.7 to 4.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And then also they're given some of this qualitative data from tribal elders. One of my favorite ones deals with ice skating, and they talk about how they used to ice skate from November to February on the lake here. And there was a lot of ice out there. Nowadays, you do not have it. I don't know when the last time the lake will completely freeze or has froze. So the idea is the students will be given these 8 pieces of data without having really an introduction to what the tribal document says. And with these 8 pieces of data, they will rank them. And when they do that, oftentimes, because the way science class has been taught for, and it's to focus on that quantitative data. And so you see a lot of the students rank the quantitative data as the most important data, or oftentimes the figure that's provided as the most important piece of data. And then they have that qualitative data follow. So after they get this opportunity to kind of look at these 8 pieces of data, the 4 qualitative pieces and the 4 quantitative pieces, they then are assigned roles. And the role that each student is given, it'll fall into 4 different options. They're either tribal scientists, tribal council, a state scientist, or this provocateur role, which essentially is the question master. They kind of lead the discussion. And within their roles, each one is given a handout, which I've created and placed at the end of this document. The tribal scientist handout is a collection of those quotes like I read earlier from the CSKT report, and also it's the mission statements from the various tribal science agencies on the CSKT. And so if we look just real quick at those, so we've got the Natural Resource Department, and so it's got their different mission statements. And one of the things that is really important when looking at their mission statements is they always go back to this perpetuating cultural values and the quality of life for the people of the reservation. And throughout their mission statements, they're talking about making sure that the resources on the Flathead Reservation are here for future generations and that cultural values are maintained. And so this one group of students would get the tribal scientist document. One group of students gets the tribal council document, which is a combination of the CSKT document, but also I took some of the main parts of the bylaws of the tribal council. So they might start looking at it from a financial standpoint, and also from the idea that the federal government and primarily the Interior Department, they actually have to work with the tribe on certain issues. And so if you're a tribal council member, you're going to focus maybe more on this relationship with the federal government and the dollars, where if you're a tribal scientist, maybe you're more concerned about preserving cultural land and or plants and things like that. But anyway, so we give them these different roles, and then they come back and they have an opportunity to calibrate in their jobs. So they would work with other students that have the same role, and they would kind of make a collective voice of what their group does and how their group sees this situation with the data that we were provided earlier now, and if that data, that lens has changed. After that, we do what's called a pinwheel discussion, and I don't know how familiar people are with this, but essentially you have all the desks facing the interior of the classroom, and you'd have one student from each of the 4 groups would be in the center of that pinwheel, and the people that are on their in the same group would sit behind them. And so only the people in the middle of the pinwheel are allowed to discuss. And so the provocateur's role would be to ask some of the first questions. And I provided some of those questions, and also the teacher helps prior to the pinwheel discussion lay out questions that they should be asking these different groups, so the whole class can kind of see the difference between a state scientist and a tribal scientist, and a tribal council member and a tribal scientist, and so forth. So we do this discussion, and these discussions, because they're structured and they have, you know, only one person able to talk at a time, and it has to be the person on the inside, it's really important that the teacher is kind of keeping tabs on some of the main themes they're bringing up, but also when it's time to rotate a new student from the group into the pinwheel. And so they're kind of what we call the hot seat. And so then they have an opportunity to go in there and talk. And so that discussion becomes the most important part as far as making sure that each student understands everybody's perspective. And so after we have the discussion, what I want the students to reflect on is how their opinion on the data changed, those original 8 points. Do they still see the quantitative data more important than the qualitative? Do they think one piece is more important than another? Or do they still believe, you know, kind of the same prior to that discussion? And then this also gives me an opportunity to have them look at some of the essential understandings. And so specifically, I've kind of highlighted essential understanding number 3 and number 6, and those documents are attached at the bottom. Just to kind of summarize, understanding number 3 looks at the idea of spirituality, and number 6 at history being subjective. And so the students have an opportunity to, once again, hopefully, if they haven't been already taught the essential understandings, kind of go back over number 3 and number 6 and have a little discussion as a class to kind of highlight how those understandings related to the discussion we had the day before, and how we can see the voice of these individual Native Americans being translated through their tribal council, and also through some of those qualitative pieces of data that they're using. And then for that second extension, then we would have quantitative and qualitative data kind of being at the forefront, where we introduce those actual terms if we haven't already, and make sure that they understand the difference between the two. And then finally, that leads us to an opportunity to write an argumentative essay. And the topic of the essay really focuses on why qualitative data is important. I want them to start to realize at this point, hopefully, that the qualitative data that has been passed on traditionally through whether that's stories or traditional ceremonies and things like that, it is very useful. We don't want to lose that information, and we find value in that information that can then be used even scientifically to help make decisions. And so the students would have an opportunity to argue about the importance of qualitative data. And then, you know, from there, I haven't really hatched out what the next steps are, but I think an important piece would make sure that we have an opportunity to look through those essays and of our classmates and see if there's an opportunity to kind of prove our point, or have a little more of a discussion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. students are probably going to have a lot of questions too to help them dig into that document after this activity. You know, a lot of questions that are going to drive them into further research.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, yeah, it definitely extends itself into lots of different things. I think the big takeaway and what has always caught my attention is when reading through the CSKT's climate change report is just how valuable the stories are that they have tribal elders share. And I think that oftentimes, you know, in the science classroom, when we look at data, we spend most of our time focused on the quantitative data. And I think that it's extremely important, especially under the context of Indian Education for All, that we are focusing on the stories that the tribal elders have passed on for generations, and use that in our classrooms as a tool, and to show that, you know, observations are very powerful, and the tribes have been here a lot longer than the Western settlers, and they have a pretty strong understanding of what Montana was like prior to Western scientists coming here.
Yeah, and definitely that human experience is a lot of what other humans can attach themselves to, or what they can connect to, and it definitely has an effect. I think another thing that you touched on is the sovereignty piece of Indian Education for All. I know that that is something that is so difficult for students and adults to think about, a sovereign nation within another nation, and how does that work? And you bringing up that tribal council piece, and that they're working with the government, and, you know, that they have influence, and they're, you know, influenced by the scientists. They're also thinking about their culture, their cultural preservation, and how to work with government agencies to make sure that everybody is represented, is an example of that, and one that we can connect to and understand. So I think for students at my level, definitely 3 through 5, and probably all the way up, that's something that is, it's hard to understand how that works.
Yeah, it definitely is, and it's a very interesting dynamic. And even on the reservation, here on the CSKT's reservation, you have state fisheries, and you have the bison range, which is managed by the federal government, which there's a possibility of a takeover in some of that. But the idea still is that you have these state scientists working alongside tribal scientists, and they all say they have the same common goals, but when you look closer at their mission statements, they don't always match up. And I think this is an opportunity for students to see that a tribal scientist is looking at really focusing on preserving animals and culture for the long run. And state scientists, there's not a lot of talk about culture when we look at those documents. And so, you know, when we look at their mission statements, if I can get down here to the state scientist one, you know, their mission statements are about ensuring that Montana's land and water resources are providing benefits for future generations. So they still have that longevity in mind, but what that longevity, how it looks to them is different. And when you get a little more closer into the document, you start to see things like their core values are serving the public, embracing the public trust, working with landowners, providing leadership. And so they do overlap, but there's also some things that I definitely think are important to point out to students.
I thought the honor, tradition, and heritage piece on there was the biggest connection that I saw, and I hadn't really thought about it like that before, you know. And it was when I was reading through all of your documentation for this, that's something that stood out to me for sure. It was just that sovereignty and how those two roles work together, and it's what a difficult task.
Yeah,
it's a lot of argumentation right there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Questions, comments? I have a quick question, Bill. Do you remember when we were in Bozeman, like, I don't remember when it was, last year, and so you were talking about this, but was there another report that they put out about managing wildlife? Or
so the tribe they've got several reports out. They have a big one currently that was released with the Montana Department of Transportation in regards to all of the wildlife crossings that were put in. So they worked with them and researchers from University of Montana and Montana State. And so with that, they looked pretty extensively at how the wildlife crossings are helping with wildlife fatalities on the highways and things like that. And it's a pretty intensive document as well. The tribe in general, the Salish and Kootenai, they have entire wildlife departments that are doing research all the time. And so they're working alongside a lot of the state scientists and federal scientists on various projects. And so there's lots of documentation that they provide on their website. And so if you go into the wildlife department, you can kind of find things. They have a whole document on how they plan to manage the wolf population and things like that. So there's lots and lots of, they have lots of resources available on their website.
Okay.
So they might have something about bears.
So it would be under natural resources on their.
Yeah, so there's, and some of them are a little harder to kind of get to, but yeah, there's a whole separate website for the documentation on the animal crossings, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's a whole different, because it's a collaborative website that they did with the state Montana Department of Transportation and some of those universities.
Okay.
And I know they're currently doing like a wolverine study. And so the tribe, I mean, you can contact them too, and they're pretty good about sharing information. But yeah, it's pretty amazing the things that they've been doing in the wildlife biology department for sure, what they're focusing on up here.
Thank you.
Anybody else, Michelle or Rachel, before we wrap things up?
Well, actually, I had asked Bill to work with him on that, the Animal Crossing one with Mia, maybe.
Yeah, it's a work in
Maybe
progress still, but that's the
Yeah.
plan.
Yeah, but incorporate engineering too.
Yeah.
I think the example lessons you guys have shown are fantastic. Are you making them available to anybody? Like on a website or?
They're going to be available through NESP and through our course, regional course,
Okay.
offered in January. And so
Okay.
if you're thinking about signing up for that course, this is these are two of the workshops that will be presented. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank both of you for sharing and Rachel for attending. We're right at an hour now that, it's a little bit late, but we had gotten on a little bit late, but we're not going to continue. I'm just going to call it there, and thank you so much. Please come back and join again in January.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice holiday.
You too.